Good evening, everybody. My name is Anna Spooner, and I'm part of the Tastings and Events team at the Wine Society. Joined this evening, as always, or more often than not recently, by the lovely Mahesh behind the scenes. So thank you so much for Mahesh for joining us tonight. I'm sure you're going to have just as much fun as I am. It's not going to feel like work tonight. I can promise you that. So before I introduce Hugh, and I will keep it as short and sweet as possible so we can hear more from him, I thought I would just do a small bit of housekeeping. I can see some of you are using the chat already, which is fantastic. Please continue to do so and make sure that you select everyone, not just all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, only Mahesh and I will be able to see. Other than that, please also use the Q&A button. The Q&A can help Mahesh and I to filter through some questions, and we should be able to ask them of Hugh at the end of the session. We've saved a few minutes, so hopefully all is well there. I did note that a couple of people had trouble logging on, so fingers crossed. We're well into the hundreds now, so I think hopefully everyone has signed in all right. If you are joining with the wines tonight, I will tell you a little bit more as we go on. But first of all, I have to introduce Hugh, and I need to do so with a glass in hand, I think. I'm joining from the showroom tonight because it's a special occasion. They allowed me after hours keys, but I feel in the most fortunate position that for the second time, I have the pleasure of sharing an evening with the charming, insightful and entertaining Hugh Johnson OBE, backed by unprecedented popular demand. And he probably needs no introduction, but I will be short. You're currently on the 8th edition of the World Atlas of Wine. And I'm not joking, members, when I say when I needed a book to prop up my laptop in the showroom, the first book I grabbed today was the World Atlas of Wine, which Hugh tells me is an old edition and needs replacing. But it is one of the finest books in the canon of the wine world, which he now shares with Jancis Robinson. And also, he's on his 42nd annual pocket wine book. So one of the best-selling, I think the best-selling wine writer in the entire world.
Correction, Anna. 45.
45? Goodness, how did I miss 3?
Terrifying. Simply terrifying.
Terrifying. Well, honestly, Hugh, I'm a little bit emotional, given that it's my final week at the Wine Society. And you are my final Zoom guest, and such an icon and such an inspiration to many people in the wine industry, including myself. So to Hugh, cheers and thank you. I'm going to have a sip. I don't normally drink on stage.
I will say cheers to everybody. Good evening, everybody. I'll have to have something in my glass, won't I?
Good idea. So this evening
probably want to know what it is, don't you?
Well, absolutely. Which is the wine that you've chosen to drink with us this evening, Hugh?
This one.
So Hugh's chosen the Ventoux, which is fantastic. I've got all of the wines this evening. And as we go through, I am going to, it's slightly different. We're going to have conversation that's guided by the 5 wines that Hugh, or what 4 wines, I should say, 4 wines and a Calvados that Hugh chose. I will guide you very shortly through the wines. We want to hear from Hugh, so it's going to be more about Hugh, but certainly guided by the wines that he selected personally for this event. So with that in mind, and since we're sharing a glass together, and I happen to have the first wine, which is the manzanilla, would you be able to tell us a little bit about why you chose this wine, Hugh? And I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, I certainly had to have a sherry in my collection because it's something I drink almost every day, before lunch, with lunch, because people are always surprised how well sherries go with food, with almost any food, I find. And the one you have there is the manzanilla, which is the lightest. It's a sort of summer sherry for me, and which I haven't been drinking much recently because I'm still on winter sherry. And my winter sherry, which is also on the Wine Society's list, is the most wonderful Palo Cortado, with a very pretty Spanish maiden on the label. Palo Cortado being a rather rare sherry, which is not Amontillado, it's not Oloroso, but it's in that sort of area. It's rich but dry, very rich. It's the most marvelous wine to go with so many things. I mean, people think sherry is before a meal. I think sherry is with a meal, with almost anything. I had Palo Cortado with smoked salmon yesterday. A very good combination. So sherry is very big, and I certainly couldn't have missed out sherry. It was my introductory wine. The alternative, of course, would have been champagne or bubbly in some form or other, which could well have come from these shores these days. Not ruling out English bubbly at all.
And you mentioned, I will mention the book now, Hugh, because one of the lovely reasons that we're speaking this evening is you have just, well, you've sort of taken Wine, A Life Uncorked, if I'm correct, and expanded, because, and I've got my numbers wrong already, so I may do it again. I think it was 2005 that Wine, A Life Uncorked was released.
That sounds right. Yes, I think so.
If you say it's right, it could be right. So you've sort of added to it and expanded on it, and now is this incredible book. I'd show you one, but I have it on Kindle with me in my bag, which is The Life and Wines of Hugh Johnson. And you have a beautiful comment on sherry in the book about not having much of it in your cellar, but that's because you need to drink it quick and fresh, which I thought was wonderful. And perhaps on that note, you might be able to tell members a little bit more about the book. You'll certainly do a better job than I did.
Sorry, I missed that. I'm sorry. In my definition.
I was hoping you might be able to expand a little on the book, on the life and wine.
Yeah.
Johnson.
Well, as you can imagine, if you've spent half a century or more, as I have, in wine, on the fringes of wine, talking to wine people, drinking it every day, you accumulate a lot of stories. I've, frankly, the book could have been 5 times as long, but my very sensible editor said, no, keep it down. It's a wander through my acquaintance with wine from the very beginning. How did I get into it? Which is the first question everyone asks. The second question they ask is, can I come in too? I'd like to. So it's that, and then it wanders around the world, telling how different kinds of wine came into my life, how I love them, how I use them. It wanders all over the place. It's actually I base it on the cellar we had when we lived in a rather large house in the country, which had enormous, capacious cellars. I never worked, it was a Tudor house in Essex. I never worked out why they had 4 rooms of cellars, because Tudor times they didn't even have bottles of wine. So I don't know what went on down there.
But you put them to good use.
Oh, I feel it. Oh, yes, I feel it.
It is a lovely, I would describe it almost as a love affair. It's sort of beautiful notions that you write to different styles of wine.
It's a love affair without the complications.
Without complications. Yes, true. Love in its most simple form, perhaps.
Yeah.
It is absolutely magical. And members, if you are enjoying this sherry this evening, I will pop up. We certainly aren't going to be in too many PowerPoints this evening. I'll just share it in case anybody wants to know the wine that Hugh did select. It's a half bottle, which, like you say, Hugh, is actually a perfect lunchtime size. So perfect lunchtime size. And it's from a wonderful 6th generation family, the Barbadillo family, made in a Solera system and the manzanilla style. So lovely, fresh. Hugh says it's a summer sherry. I do agree. But I have to say it's a sherry my family drink all year round. My father for Christmas asked for 12 of these. So I'm not sure how quickly he's got through them, but I did give him 12 half bottles of this exact wine. So I was touched when you chose it.
Yes, in case anyone's confused, manzanilla is a form of fino. So it is in that pale, dry area of sherry, coming from San Luca de Barrameda, which is on the coast, on the estuary of the Guadalquivir River. And the beach of San Luca, I always enjoy this bit, is where Magellan set off on his first round-the-world voyage. Columbus set off from there too. It was where you pushed off from, having filled your ship with barrels of manzanilla, which is it's a little lighter than a vino. It's not. It's actually about the same strength as a big Aussie Chardonnay or something, about 15 degrees. So it doesn't overcome you straight away on a hot day.
I've read before, I can't remember where, but you mentioned something about it being a bit unfair that it falls into the fortified category, because like you say, you know, it's 15%. It's not outside the world of non-fortified white wines. So on that note, I would love to move on to our first white wine, or our only white wine, by definition, which is the exhibition Chablis that you chose. Members, if you've been tasting all the wines as I have, please make sure you have some water to refresh your palate for the Chablis. And for those of you who've read the book, it might be more obvious or very obvious why Hugh chose a Chablis. I particularly adored, as the Chablis lover, adored your part in the book where you sort of explain and profess why Chablis is so wonderful. So for those who haven't read it, and for myself, for my own enjoyment, perhaps you could tell people, Hugh, why you have such a soft spot for Chablis.
Yes, I would say Chablis is by default white wine, which doesn't sound like very high praise, but it does say it comes in happily everywhere. What is it? It is a pure Chardonnay wine from the north of Burgundy. It's the big difference, really, apart from the soil influence, which is very strong, is that it is not normally. It's untouched by oak barrels. It is the purity of the Chardonnay. Your Meursaults, your Pulignies, your Courton Charlemagne, Morasses, and all that taste almost as much of oak in the barrel they're kept in as they do of the Chardonnay grape. Well, Chardonnay on its own seems to me to be so well balanced, so appetizing, and can make a really dry wine, very dry wine, which it doesn't lack anything. You don't think, I wish this had a bit more fruit, a bit more flavor, a bit more sweetness. The balance is there. It's gentle on the palate, but firm. The acidity is very important. But then acidity is important in every wine. Can you imagine a wine without any acidity? You wouldn't notice it going down. So Chablis goes with most everything. I love a glass on its own. It goes with my lunch, after the sherry, that is, or any other meal. There's always Chablis in the door of my fridge. I think the fridge door wine is terribly important. I'm always ready to have another glass, and I drink 2 Chablis from the Society. That normally, one is the Society's Chablis, which is very good. The other is the Society's exhibition Chablis, which is even better. It is more flavory. It's better. It goes with more foods. The exhibition Chablis is worth a lot of rather smart Premier Cru Chablis in my book.
And I'm pleased you say that. 2021, the vintage we're on now, is a tough vintage, and I know that Toby, our buyer, actually worked very hard to secure the wine that he did with J.M. Brocard, and also to get the price, because as most of our members will know, the price of Burgundy is sort of going through the roof, and Chablis seems to have somehow managed to not quite get so excited, should we say?
Well, there's a great deal of it, and the Chablis area is very, very big. It's not limited like Meursaults is a fraction of the size. So not all Chablis is very good because the area is so big, but the Society, Brocard is very, very good grower and negotiant, and the buyers know how to get the good stuff out of it. The other thing about it is that I'm not necessarily drinking the latest vintage. You say it's the 21. I will have bottles going back to 18 at least. because fine white Burgundy, Chablis included, does improve with a little age. It is not a question of rushing to get the latest thing. Keep it for 2, 3, 4 years, and there's more Chablis about it. It just it intensifies the character. So that's what I do. I'm probably drinking the 18 at the moment.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a lovely sentiment. I have, oh yes, John in the chat has just said he's had a lovely 2012 Chablis recently. And you often get asked what happens to wine when they age, but I like the idea that it just gets more Chablis.
Well, not forever, but for a few years.
So yes, members, if you're interested, this is our exhibition. I'll show you the bottle again. Mahesh will hopefully kindly put in the chat a link as well, should you be interested. Sorry, the lighting's less good for the bottles. But hopefully, if members haven't tried it before, it is a lovely wine. And dare I say it, it's
another remark about it is that I'm very keen on half bottles, and that's something the Society does very well. There are quite a few half bottles, because I like to vary my drinking, and I don't need to take a decision that it's going to be one bottle for the evening. It can be 1.5, but I love opening half bottles. And what the other thing I was going to say was, I've forgotten it. Can anyone remind me?
I wish I could. If I could poke into your mind, Hugh, I'd stay there forever. So I wish I certainly could. No, it's a fabulous wine. I don't drink enough Chablis. I think, the world went Chardonnay mad, and Chablis perhaps got a little bit forgotten. And certainly, it's such a pleasure wine. So thank you.
I wish that there was somebody in the New World, which is big on Chardonnay, as we all know. Mm-hmm. I don't know any grower in California, Australia, even maybe New Zealand, where it pursues the character of the Chardonnay in the Chablis manner, because it's so much easier to look a bit French by using oak barrels.
I love that. Easier to look French. I quite agree. And the true heart doesn't mean it has to be over oaked. Kindly, Mahesh has just put in the chat all the half bottles we have on sale. Something I commented on recently. Actually, we've even increased quite considerably our stock. So
there's one other point here, which is that I do wish that there was Chablis with a screw cap. I'm very strong on screw caps. I get quite tired of winding away at the corkscrew, which I do very often, as you may imagine. I love screw caps, and I see no downside for wines that you're going to drink within very few years. I mean, long-range wines, it may be different. Your smart clarets and so on may need long corks, but most wines don't. I rather think it's because growers or bottlers don't like to have to change over the bottling line to do screw caps. I don't know. I mean, it complicates life if most of your wine goes under a cork to then have some with a screw cap. But I do think for something like the Society Chablis, a screw cap would be a real advantage.
And I know we actually had a question from a member asking which closure you preferred, natural cork, diem, or Stelvin. Now, the member didn't even include screw cap. So Nick Cooper, screw cap is favoured by Hugh, but like you say, Hugh, not appropriate for all wines necessarily, although there's a lot of research. But I quite agree. A screw cap on a Chablis makes it more of a picnic-friendly wine as well. Lovely. So I'm particularly excited to taste the next wine. I've not tasted this vintage yet. So we do have a red wine, and we've got lots of stories to regale over the reds. So Hugh, this is the wine that you have. The Ventoux.
Sorry. Le Traverse.
Yes, exactly. Le Traverse. So there's a lovely part in the book where you talk about visiting Sablé. Now, for personal reasons, which is that I will be moving to the Southern Rhone this weekend, relocating. Both Sablé and Mont Ventoux, where this wine are made, are my new neighbours. So when you chose this wine, it really felt like an exciting moment for me, because I get to talk about my new home with one of my heroes. But there is a lovely part of the book where you talk about your honeymoon, I believe, with Judy. Is that correct, in Sablé?
That was one of the, we went all over the problem. We did go there, that's true.
So I'd love if you could talk a little more on this wine, and it's the one that's in your glass as well. So if you could let members know, it's also the cheapest wine, I think, of the evening, which is fantastic, and hopefully a good value.
Well, Anna, it had to be one of the Côte du Rhône villages, I think, because there's a huge amount of wine. You know, in a sense, among French wines, to drink regularly, it's either Bordeaux or the Rhône, because there's so much of it. And the different villages in the Côte du Rhône have different characters, it's true, but they're all basically made of the Grenache grape with some Carignan, some others, a bit of Syrah, but they have this gentle character, firm but gentle, I would say. They don't, they certainly don't shout or scream at you. They're good, steady, satisfying with food drinking, or indeed without food, because this Ventoux, Ventoux, by the way, is a name known for much else besides, it's the Mont Ventoux, which means the windy mountain, features in a lot of the Impressionist paintings. It was first famously painted mountain, I should think, and it's near Aix-en-Provence. It's surrounded with vineyards. There's an awful lot of it. Would I know the difference between a Ventoux and another Côte du Rhône? Would I? No way.
Very honest.
But this is a delicious drink.
That sounds like what's important to me. And yes, exactly. This is made by the it was made by Paul Jaboulet Annay, not actually owned by the Annay family anymore, bought out by the Frey family. And Caroline Frey makes the wines now. Fantastic winemaker.
For mentioning the Jaboulet, which I should have done really. The Jaboulet label is pretty much a guarantee on any of the Rhône wines that they do, all the way from Hermitage down and around the Rhône and up the Rhône. It's a very sound historic house, and its label is very familiar to me. I've always got various Jabulets in my cellar.
And you mentioned sort of in the book doing a lot of traveling in that area and others. You describe it quite vividly and beautifully as well. And I wondered, whilst we're talking about parts of the world to visit, should we say, be it on honeymoon or otherwise, are there any other parts of the wine world that were just, I mean, Mont Ventoux, naturally, it's an Impressionist painting paradise. The villages are beautiful, but what other regions really inspired you when you visited?
Well, my goodness, wine encompasses so many marvelous places. There are dramatic ones like the Douro Valley with the port vineyards, or the Moselle Valley with the Riesling Moselle vineyards there, which are steep, which are terraced, which go down to dramatic rivers. I've got some amazing memories, especially of the Douro Valley. The most amazing being, I think, one of the first times I went there with, I think it was with Harvey's of Bristol. So it was a very long time ago, which was probably 50 years ago. They were just stopping, taking the wine down the river from the port, from the Quintas, where it was made, way upstream, down to the lodges in Villanova de Gaia, Porto, in fact, by the old Barca Robello, which was, it looked just like a Viking ship, pointed at both ends, great big heavy wooden boat. And so Harvey of Bristol organized this last trip down the Douro, rowed by 8 oarsmen, standing far forward to control this great heavy. There were 16 pipes of port. A pipe is a very big barrel on board, so it was extremely heavy and entirely primitive. It was steered with an oar over the stern, like a biblical or Viking ship, and it depended as much on the current as it did on the oarsmen. But it came to the rapids, because the river was untamed then. It was a wild river. Now it's dammed. Mm. But in those days, you had to shoot the rapids. And this, in a boat that weighed, I don't know, 100 tons, I dare say, was a very dramatic moment. I'll never forget it in my life. You would come to a gorge where the river got faster and faster and faster, and you had a swig at the port flask, which was going back, a wooden flask full of
for courage,
and a good swig. And everyone, they shouted, "Hold on!" And it was the most dramatic moment. The boat dropped. It was steered to the center of the rapids by the oarsman. It dropped, I should think, 20 feet. Your stomach was left in the air. It was an enormous splash. The water went miles in the air on both sides. Everyone got wet, and then you steadied and you went on down to the next rapid. Unforgettable moment.
I'm sure unforgettable, but I'm sure there's also lots of people who would rather forget, actually. A combination of terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. You've actually mentioned 2 regions that I think, well, Ventoux is interesting in the sense that it's higher up altitude-wise than other parts of the Rhone, but the Douro as well. You've mentioned 2 quite warm parts of the world. And so I thought, I'm just checking the time so we're not running over too much, but I thought we might talk momentarily on how climate has changed, how the world has changed in the time that you've been writing. I mean, you've also just described how a river has changed monumentally. But what are the biggest changes in the wine world that you've seen, be that weather or otherwise?
Well, taking the full sort of half century that I've been involved, I suppose the most fundamental one is knowledge. Mm-hmm. Because wine growers used to be the children of old wine growers, and they knew what dad and granddad had done. But when they started going to college, which is not that long ago, they started to learn things that dad and granddad never knew. The science, the chemistry, the biology, what it takes to get ripe grapes and clean grapes, and all that kind of thing. Of course, there's the introduction of machinery and all the shortcuts, but also the fundamental knowledge of how ripe do you want a grape to be. Mm. One of the great textbooks of wine was actually written by a monk, as the monks were the experts. I think we're talking about the 16th century, and he said to make perfect Burgundy, he was a Burgundian, what you need is overripe grapes, ripe grapes, and underripe grapes. Oh. That tells you a lot about the balance of the wine.
Yeah. Interesting. I think that's a lovely answer, knowledge. But you can see it passing down even generation to generation, like you say. I'm sure there are many disagreements that go on behind the scenes of wineries that we don't see. Now, I am very excited actually to try the next wine as well. I've not even tasted this yet, but it does smell absolutely delicious.
Just to talk about the smell of the Ventoux Vermouth, that rather grapey, sweet smell is basically the Grenache grape, which is the great workhorse of the fine wines of the Rhone and Garnacha in Spain. I mean, it's around the northern Mediterranean. It is a grape that doesn't have a great deal of color. The skin's not very thick. You could make pinkish wine quite easily with Garnacha. but it does have this fragrance and a degree of acidity. I was mentioning acidity, which goes with the ripeness that makes it always fresh. It's a perfect base wine, and its character comes out beautifully in this. So you might say soft fruit. You could sort of go out on a limb and say strawberry, but no. Comparisons are rarely accurate with wine. People say that this grape smells like this, that, and the other fruit. It doesn't really. It smells of itself. You have to learn what that smell is. It's relatively easy with Pinot Noir, with Cabernet Sauvignon. They've become classes of wine, and the smell has become very familiar. But it is basically, it's the smell of the grape that is the opening character of the wine. And this, I love this.
Yes, it's such a friendly grape. I always think Grenache. Of course, you can make very serious wines, but even the most serious Grenache is always friendly. And yeah, I love the wines, obviously. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be moving to the Southern Rhone.
I can say.
Yes, I think the weather the last few days has confirmed I'm making the right decision. So long as I've got a nice windproof jacket for the Ventoux.
Don't rely on the weather. I was supposed to be in California right now. And I'm glad I'm not, because the weather there is absolutely diabolical. One of my friends there calls it Califladia.
Oh, of course, yes. I've seen some absolutely insane flooding in Paso and places like that. That's been quite amazing. So
you see pictures of a reservoir in California, which is full for the first time in 30 years.
Oh my goodness.
I'm rather pleased.
Well, exactly. And a lot of the producers that are showing the flooding are saying tasting rooms are closed, which is not great, but water table is full. So I think there's an air of happiness to that for sure, especially given the other extremity. So Hugh, I'm really excited to taste the next wine. I've actually also just seen that a member has the Bordeaux, a 2004 vintage, which leads us nicely on, because I know you are a professed Bordeaux file, if such a thing were to exist. And for members that haven't seen, there is a wonderful YouTube video with yourself and Jancis Robinson, each fighting a case for Burgundy and Bordeaux. I'll send the link around tomorrow, should anybody want to watch it. But you say the most fantastic thing about Bordeaux that I've never heard anybody describe it as before, which is you call it a mongrel wine. And that captured my imagination completely. So I think of all the subject areas, I'm most excited to hear you talk about Bordeaux and what fascinates you most. This particular producer also is mentioned by name in your book. So I'm sure you know much about them and their older vintages. So I'm going to hand over to you to talk about this wine, and I'm going to enjoy myself, if that's all right.
Well, Bordeaux in general, I mean, hardly needs me to advertise it. It's been England's, Britain's favourite wine, Scotland, Ireland, very much included, for 500 years. You don't need all the history lesson, but as a result, Bordeaux claret, as I always call it claret, it's a lovely English word, was modelled around our needs and our tastes. It's not that, I mean, now it is famous in France, and you see it on restaurant lists, but it isn't the first thing they go to. It was always made as an export wine, Bordeaux being the main port of the west coast of France, trading. It made its fortune dealing in sugar and slaves. It was the port for the West Indies. But before that, it was the trading port for Britain and Northern Europe generally, shipping vast amounts of wine, which would never be made if it weren't for export. They weren't for the French inland consumption. They were specially made for us. Therefore, our taste was important. And we were looking for a light drinking wine, basically. Then there's always better versions. You start making a light drinking wine, and somebody says, I can improve on that, and I've got a better vineyard, and I've bought this chateau, and we're going to beat all the others and get higher prices, and that's what happened. They started improving on this basic drink up to the level where it becomes one of the most fascinating glasses of wine in the world. There is a huge amount of it. I mean, it has that advantage. It ages. I mean, well made, it ages like no other red wine, honestly. And pushed to the limit, to the first growth and second growth, and the class growth of both the left bank, the Medoc, and the right bank, Saint-Emilion Pomerol. These are ever-aging wines, which are given very distinct personalities by the proprietors. In Burgundy, the distinction are basically between the land and some, it's this vineyard or that better vineyard or that not so good vineyard. And we know that. We have the Grand Cru and the Premier Cru and the village wines. And then you choose your grower, but nobody's got a great deal of it. In Bordeaux, the units are huge and they are basically proprietorial. So a chateau could change hands. It could have been classed as a second or third class in the old classification, which is very old now, 1855. Things have changed. The land has been the same. It's the proprietor, it's the method of the winemaker that is up for grabs, really. And I think it's absolutely extraordinary how the pecking order, although it's different from the original, it is not that radically different. So it was based on what they could charge for the wines. When they were set about making this classification for a great exhibition in Paris in 1855, how did they go about it? They looked at the price list. They took 100 years of price lists into consideration, from 1754 to 1854. And the ones that came out on top came out on top. So, as I say, you can fool some of the people some of the time. You can't fool all the people all the time. So price is, over a long period of time, a very, very good gauge of value. Tastes change, generations change, but if a wine has always fetched much more, there's a good reason it's a better one. And now, I'm talking about Bordeaux. I mean, that
So this particular producer, they're as I mentioned, you do mention them in the book. So they're a wine that you enjoy. I always think that Homedoc offers good value. If we mention value again, I do think the Homedoc wines, the good ones, are fantastic value. So what is it about this particular producer that you enjoy?
Chateau Cantemel. I've always been fond of it, partly because I've got ancient memories of it, of course, but if you leave Bordeaux and drive north up into the Medoc, you pass signs to every name you've ever heard of in Bordeaux, practically. But the first one on the left, almost not far north of the suburbs of Bordeaux, you come to a wood or little forest. And if you look to the left, you take your eyes off the road for a moment, you'll see a glint of water. You'll see a canal of water stretching off from the road through this wood. Now that always caught my fancy, and I took the first opportunity to turn left to see what was going on. Well, it is Chateau Cantemel, which means blackbird song, lark or blackbird song. And in the woods you hear them. And you come out of the wood at the far end to the vineyard, and there is a very, very pretty, romantic, turreted chateau with an enormous, the biggest plane tree I've ever seen in the yard. And it's an outlier in a way. It's a far south of Margaux. It has the character of the southern Medoc, which is to make rather, depends on the grapes you put into it, of course, to make rather lighter, quicker maturing wines than, say, Pauillac or Saint-Estèphe in the north, which you might describe as more serious wines. This elegant, pretty character is not unserious at all. It's a damn good drink. But I was very impressed by the fact I used to be rather good friends with Baron Philippe de Rothschild of Mouton Rothschild when he first started to go to California, and they met Robert Mondavi, and that was a historic moment. But early on in my acquaintance with Bordeaux, he was a very kind man. He was a very kind chap. He has this great museum of the history of wine, art objects at Mouton Rothschild. And he very kindly entertained me. And he said, when I'm not drinking my wine, Mouton, or with other wines from Pauillac, I said, but, you know, what is your other regular claret? He said, well, I'm very fond of Chateau Cottemel, because it's kind of the opposite to Mouton. It doesn't mean, and so I got to know it there. He has an incredible cellar of old wines, and he used to serve him probably. I will never forget that he would at dinner. It was just a little dinner of two, three, or four people. An extraordinary decanter of sort of deep amber wine would be put on the table with ice floes in it, literally. The wine was so cold it was freezing. What was this? It was probably a 19th century Chateau Yquem. He had eccentric taste, but we did drink wonderful wine.
Oh, to be a fly on the wall. That was a wonderful story. Thank you. You actually mentioned a couple of times, we weren't planning on talking about it, but I think I mentioned last time, my husband is an arborist, or an arboriculturalist, I suppose. And your other love is trees. And you mentioned trees, the lovely trees at Chateau Cottemel there. Have trees influenced your love of wine in many senses?
Well, the association with oak is very, very clear, except that I don't like wines that actually taste of oak. I think if a wine tastes of oak or really smells of oak, they've overdone it. Oak has a vital role to play. Oak barrels, good oak barrels, are the perfect first maturing stage for almost all grape wines, I find. As soon as you really taste the oak, they've overdone it. So it's a question of how long it stays there, how mature the oak is, even what forest it comes from. We used to have a farm in the middle of France, a little rather rundown farm, which we chose because it was in the outskirts of the forêt de Trancé. Mm-hmm. And Trancé is the greatest oak barrel, wine barrel forest in France. It's for very interesting reasons. I don't know if anyone will follow me on this, but the best thing about the Trancé oaks is they grow very, very slowly. The soil is rubbish. The climate is all wrong. The trees regularly get frosted. You look at a Trancé plank, the grain is very, very fine. There's very little sapwood, and therefore less flavor. And funnily enough, that makes it the best of all wine barrels for maturing wine. So anyway, Trancé was an inspiration for me. It has these, the big oaks were planted by Louis XIV's minister, Colbert, in the very late 17th century. So there are 400-year-old oaks. Absolutely magnificent creatures. They go up 90 feet. Heaven knows how far around they are. An absolute inspiration. And they're used, you know, the forest is used all the time. There's always workmen in it. They're always felling great trees. And as I say, we lived very near it, or almost in it. Unforgettable, simply. Trees are huge for me. We've got some trees in North Wales now, which I simply dote on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I know we weren't planning on talking about that, but I do love hearing about your other passion. So what I did plan on asking you about was, whilst we're enjoying a lovely glass of Bordeaux, the Bordeaux Club. So if you'd be happy to share a few words on that, I'm sure members would find, I'm sure they'd find it fascinating and also be deeply, deeply jealous.
Yes, I blush when I talk about the Bordeaux Club. It's called the Bordeaux Club, which sounds a bit pretentious rather than a Bordeaux Club, because obviously there are dozens. This club was founded in Cambridge 70 odd years ago by a famous historian, Sir Jack Plum, and also one of the founders was Harry Waugh, who was very well known, very popular wine merchant, lovely man who died in his 90s, much regretted. And the point of the Bordeaux Club was that it's 6 members, that's all. 6 people around one bottle. Well, one of several bottles. The point was I was thrilled to be invited to join. It was you showed off your best bottles. So we took turns to entertain our fellow members, usually at home. 2 of them were Cambridge Dons, and they could entertain in colleges. We showed off shamelessly to each other. We had produced the best food we knew how, and opened our best bottles. So the history of the Bordeaux Club is fascinating, because it's probably the only place that tasting notes, appreciations, I would say, rather than technical tasting notes, of the greatest wines of the last century or so are in print. And there were people who really, really knew their wine, really loved their wine, and loved each other too. So it's all friendship, and it's a conversation. It's the best way that wine can be enjoyed. And if you put together all the tasting notes, every first growth of every vintage of the 20th century, I should think, is in there. Not organized, but in the sort of very jolly flowing text. I think it's a fabulous book. I helped a little bit with it, but the author, running out of my memory is absolutely so bad. I don't know my best friend's name now.
Do you mean Michael?
Neil McKendrick.
Oh, sorry. Right. Yes.
He was head of Cleves College, Cambridge, for many, many years. Now retired. Had a wonderful cellar, and as we all did, I'd like to think. And he's written this, I think, very entertaining, certainly very interesting book. And it's just called The Bordeaux Club, and it's just been published by the Académie du Vin Library, which has also republished my story of wine and my sort of more personal memoirs book called the Life and Wines.
Yes.
Sorry, I can't flash a copy to sell it to you. Anyway, the Bordeaux Club is for people who really love the wines of Bordeaux and good food and good conversation. It's a very, very special book.
Absolutely. I think members do if you are so inclined, pick up a copy. You will be jealous, though. There's no doubt about it. There's an element of jealousy, but I like that you say it's so jolly and amongst friends, Hugh. It sounds and feels like that too. So in the interests of time, I think it's probably best, if you're happy to, Hugh, we've got a couple of questions. If we finish with a nice end of evening digestif and pose a couple of members' questions to you alongside a Calvados. How does that sound? I can't believe how quickly it's gone either. I'm sort of sad. I could stay all evening. So the Calvados members, I just said to Hugh before we joined the call, I've not had Calvados in years, and so I'm absolutely thrilled. I'm very, very delighted to open a bottle. It's not something I always think of. So what made you choose this particular drink? I'm always saying wine, and that's tricky for me.
Well, I love Armagnac. Cognac does not agree with me. I can't sleep after cognac. It's just a personal thing. But I do love Armagnac. But then Calvados is a spirit with all the warmth that you'd want from it, very smooth, but with an extra bit of its appley energy. It's the acidity of apples. It's the flavor of apples comes through very clearly, and that lovely smell of fresh apples. It's different, but it's terribly appetizing. A lot of people say, "Oh, well, I have a glass of Calvados when I'm in Normandy, you know, and the true Normand is a little refresher in the middle of the meal. We drink a glass of Calvados and go on eating a glass of creamy food." It's more than that to me. It's just perfect after dinner sip. It's invigorating too. It's warming and invigorating, and it's got this pure, clear, appley, orchard-like smell and taste. So we get through a fair bit of Calvados at home, probably more than any brandy or any liqueur. Do try it, everybody.
Oh, it's smelling absolutely amazing. Marcel Orford Williams at the Wine Society. I apologize, something's just turned on in the showroom. Marcel Orford Williams, I'm sure it's him that's once said, "Oh, after you've drunk lots of red wine, the best thing to have is a sweet Gewürztraminer to sort of just, you know, do something completely different to your palate." And I can imagine something similar with Calvados. It's got that energy, that brightness, that fun to it. It's smelling.
What I want after a big red wine tasting is a glass of beer.
Yes, there's nothing busier than a beer pub after a wine trade tasting, that's for sure. Oh, it is absolutely gorgeous. So I'm going to sip along if it's all right, and then I think we've got time for a couple of questions. There's one that I'm sure you get asked all the time, but I think it's a real goodie. So Colin has asked, what would be your desert island wine?
Only one. Oh.
Well, Nick's asked, what's your favorite Bordeaux for your desert island wine? So if that makes anything easier.
Okay, well, I do have a personal connection with Chateau Latour because I was on the board of directors there for years and years, and Latour has so much individuality, so much style. I think such a recognizable smell and taste. It's austere. It's nothing velvety. Well, I know wines, I know, but there's nothing sort of smooth or coaxing about it. When you smell it, it's God. Oh, mighty! What am I smelling? It smells of rusty old hulks on the seashore. It's very irony. It's very maritime. It smells of sea air. It comes from the slopes of the Gironde estuary, and it needs aging. But when I was on the board of directors, the Grand Vin is Chateau Latour. The second wine is Les Forts de Latour, which is frankly not terribly different. I mean, it's slightly less grand, but marvelous wine. So at one earlier director's tasting in the tasting room, I said, "Okay, but what happens to all the wine that doesn't make it to be Les Forts de Latour?" He said, "Well, you know, it gets distributed locally," and that's. And I said, "What? Well, we could do better than that." So it became labelled as simply Pauillac, and then in tiny letters, "Produce of Chateau Latour" at the bottom of the label. And the label is sort of recognizable because it's got a rather elegant drawing of the famous dovecot, which is the Tower of Latour. It's frankly, I think it's got the almost identical smell, if less character. It's very distinctive, as I described it as being irony, and so that is, you know, almost our most regular claret these days. I just love it. It's a flavour that does everything for me. So
So you'll have a case.
Don't all rush and drink it all, will
you? Thank you. A slightly similar question, but with a different twist. James has asked, is there an off-field wine or a sort of quirky, more unusual wine that you've come across recently? And if so, what was the context?
Well, I'm not sure whether you call England off-field or not. You shouldn't by now, because it's established itself as a producer of absolutely marvelous sparkling wine. And so a big part of our drinking at home now is English bubbly. Mm-hmm. I like the word bubbly because it's a cheerful English word. The fact that it is sort of officially known as English sparkling wine is pretty boring. I mean, bit of a mouthful. No, it's bubbly. It's not like champagne. It doesn't try to be like champagne, except in being a first-class Rolls-Royce bubbly wine made of mainly Chardonnay, also the usual Pinot Noir, perhaps Pinot Meunier, the classic champagne blend, but the Blanc de Blanc, the Chardonnay one alone. I mean, I had a bottle the other night of one made by the sadly late friend, Stephen Spurrier. Very sad, he died last year, but he started this vineyard in Dorset called Bride Valley. And the Bride Valley Blanc de Blanc is an absolute model, exquisite purity, character, and many others. I mean, I could name 20 easily first-class English bubblies, and sadly, there isn't that much of a price difference between English bubbly and champagne. You'd hope that you'd get it at a lower price, but the costs are the same, frankly. And the duty is this absurd £11.50 a bottle or something. That so you're paying the government as much as the winemaker. But I do, if anyone hesitates about drinking English fizz or bubbly, don't hesitate. There's the original, almost the founders of the game. There's Ridgeview, Nye Timber, are well known and big, but explore. I mean, you've got one locally, I expect, if you live in the south of England. Well, go for
it. They're less and less hard to find now, so there's no excuse. And on that note, I've actually got a question from Peter that Peter Cousins has asked, Hugh, apart from the sherry, all the drinks that you have chosen come from France, whereas the books cover all winemaking countries. Do you consider France to still be the best?
Yes.
There we go.
No, I mean, I am formed, as the French would say, on the French model of wine. And the experiments over centuries that the French must have done to come up with the Pinot Noir, the Cabernet Sauvignon, the Syrah, and so on, they've paid off. They know how to do it, and they've found the very, very good terroir to grow them in, and match everything up. It's not just the soil, it's not just the grape, it is the culture. It is the historic memory of what it is that they're aiming at, which is paramount to me, really. I'm not saying that others don't do it as well or have great results, but there's something to be said for the original. So I'm not I try wine from all over the world. I enjoy wine from all over the world. But if you ask me where I come home to, it's basically France. France has a fine wine tradition, which doesn't exist, for example, in Spain or in Italy. They just didn't make fine wine historically. It sounds controversial, but Germany is almost the only wine country that went in for fine wine historically over the ages. You could say that Hungary had also a fine wine tradition. This is true. But it was almost the French monopoly, and in my cellar, to my shame, it is almost a monopoly.
Oh, lovely. Thank you so much, Hugh. I've got one sneaky last question, and a member has asked you what the lovely painting behind you is.
Yes, it's is sort of Japanese fantasy. I found it in San Francisco. It was painted by an English artist, and it was in the market in San Francisco, and I simply couldn't resist it ages ago. It's a watercolor. But I'm glad you mentioned it because it's very, very attractive, isn't it?
It's absolutely beautiful. And it's been a pleasure generally to be allowed a little insight into your home, a little more understanding of your cellar, and of course, the stories of your wine life, Hugh. So honestly, I can't thank you enough. It's been an absolute pleasure.
You've given me a very entertaining evening too. Everybody likes talking about themselves, don't they?
Not everyone's as good at it as you are, Hugh. That's the difference. You happen to be exceptionally good at not just yourself, but talking about wine and the world. And I did see one member saying they could picture the driveway of Cantermal as you described it. So your way with words is transcendent, honestly.
Well, Anna, I have to say, enjoy your life in the south of France. We'll miss you at the Wine Society, I think, but maybe you'll stay in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone behind the scenes who helped organise this evening. Thank you to members for coming, Mahesh as well tonight, to Judy, who helped with lighting and all sorts as well behind the scenes in the same ilk this evening. But most of all, thank you to Hugh. Honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.